the state's counterplan, the court's counterplan, then overview on policy topics. Is that good?
Yeah.
Alright. So listen aloud. When I say it, please. Should be like 3 seconds. Okay. Not going for the proliferation impact, which means that there's no impact to any of the slow proliferation arguments or any reason for why they can solve that argument. However, the warming debate, there are 2 key concessions. First, they have 0 defense extended in the 2R on the CO2 impact. That means it's key to ocean acidification, key to prevent biodiversity loss, and key to solve oxygen. The only thing the 2R says is uniqueness overwhelms the link, which is a claim without a warrant after the timer beep, which means that it's try or die for the affirmative if we win a question that they can solve warming. The second concession is even more key, however, and is that nuclear power is the only way to eliminate CO2 reductions, which means that even if they win an argument for why U.S.-China relations happen, that if they cannot solve the nuclear industry, which is an argument they consistently conceded throughout the debate, there's no way for them to solve warming because nuclear power is the only way. That's our 2AC valid evidence, which indicates that any sort of emissions-free reduction can happen, and our 1AC more evidence indicates that other alternatives can solve, which means that if the status quo retards nuclear energy, then it's impossible to solve warming, which means that CO2 collapses inevitable and causes extinction, and it's impossible if we vote affirmative, which means it's try or die for the affirmative. Now the economic model advantage. At the top, we have a double bind on this flow. First, if it is true that the economic model is resilient, then that takes out the entirety of the thesis that it had because it proves that the countries will always have open trades. However, if it is not true, then this argument is entirely false and proves the inevitability of the dissent. This is an argument that I was getting at in cross-sex and Ross explained in the 1AR. Our argument indicates that their card itself says that countries are turning inward. It cites things like Europe saying, quote, Europe will probably turn more inward-looking. Japan and the crisis of disaster and the concept of export-led growth is no longer possible, which clearly proves the argument that growth is now going to be protectionism. This is the thesis of our Garnsky evidence and our Patton evidence indicates that a collapse of the U.S. economic model causes economic nationalism and increased trade ties, which means that even if you vote negative, that a future trade war will still happen because economic cooperation will cease to exist because the U.S. economic model will cause people to turn inwards because they no longer trade with the United States and cause increasing U.S. economic nationalism. We don't need to go for this as offense, which means that Barbary arguments, etc., all don't matter, which is probably a double term with the rest of the advocacy, but that'll be later. The only other argument I have to answer this flow is that developing economy is key to growth. That's literally what the 2R says. There is no warrant, no explanation, no answer to the counter arguments. Do not even call for the card because the developing economy key to growth argument was not even sufficiently explained. Our Schilling evidence and our Crespi evidence, as well as the piece of evidence I forget that indicates decoupled, indicates the housing market is key to the U.S. economy because it's a principal driver of the main source of assets. They can see that the rest of the world is not decoupled from the United States because it's a key market for developed countries' economies, which means that we internally turn your arguments, which means that if we went internally to U.S. economic collapse, which is inevitable in the status quo, then the global economic trade wars will be inevitable. That's our Patton and Garton evidence, which means that there is no uniqueness for the trade war that this had. Even if they can prevent it in this one instance, the long-term instances won't matter. Now, the next flow. They make this incoherent argument about the Collins evidence. They fundamentally have no explanation for this in the 2R. Their evidence is also quite poor on this evidence. What we have to say is extend our level of frac evidence indicates that people want to come to the United States, and as long as we issue the visa, people will do that. They've also not made a soft theory in the concept of EB5 visa, which means it doesn't matter. Next one. The court's flow. This is a concession, a bloody concession, but a concession nonetheless. They conceded that democracies solve war. So if plenary powers are high right now, they conceded our diamond evidence, which indicates that democracies do not go to war with each other, which was an argument that was explicitly extended in the 1AR as a reason why the dissent's not inevitable. This at best should be some terminal impact defense, a reason why the U.S. and China will not go to war with each other because the United States will not go to war with a semi-democratic nation, which means that only you should prefer environmental collapse impacts, such as our warming impacts, because they're non-state actors, and you should not, and you should filter this through the areas of how they would react to something like China bashing. Okay, overview. 100% risk of voting negative causes extinction. They've had no argument for why the status quo can solve warming. They've conceded our argument, which is the 1AR card that Ross read, that indicates that relations are terminally screwed between China and the United States, which means that it's try or die for the United States. They conceded our more evidence indicates that we spread it to other countries, and etc., which means that their evidence says that China and the United States could help solve warming, but that's a necessary condition to solve warming, which means that we can still solve our warming internally. Even if they win that we can't solve warming, it's still try or die, which means that voting affirmative is the only way we can alleviate this concern. Second is that collapse of the U.S. economy will collapse our economic model, causing countries to turn inward. That's our gates upon our evidence, which means that economic national protectionism, etc., make all conflict inevitable. There's no new 2R arguments that are argument. Now we're extend our impact defense here. There's no risk of China war. This was not a new claim. It was made in the 2AC. Our 2AC evidence indicates that they won't risk doing anything that will hurt their economy, which means that even if the United States China bashes, that they would still maintain interdependence and they would still not cause an escalatory trade war. They conceded our 1AR desk evidence, which has zero answer to that side from the fact that it's new, except for the fact that it's an answer to the new 1R impact that you read. Our desk evidence indicates things like governance as well as local competition, mean that even if bashing occurred, they would still do things like cooperate outside of trade frameworks. They have to cooperate outside trade frameworks. Their best piece of evidence are their Ferguson cards, which indicates that it could upset China, and their second piece of evidence indicates that if a trade war did occur, that may cause some. If a war did occur, it could escalate out of control. They have not read a piece of evidence indicates it would reach that level of threshold. Their turns case arguments make literally no sense. They say turns economic model advantage. They conceded that their evidence is off on this question. That as long as the United States has an economic model as long as the United States still has a strong economy, that other countries have an incentive to model our economy, which means that even if we bash some other countries, they would still keep open trade relations. They say the relation to key to solve warming, our indent of their card still stands. There's zero evidence that indicates that they can solve relations, which means that even if relations solve warming, they can't do that. And we have new impact events. Also, our Salam evidence indicates that incremental reform can't solve. They have to be massive technological breakthroughs, which means there's no risk that relations with China alone are enough to solve. It's try or die. Now the limelight. Their internal